space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise.
Most illogical reaction.
Welcome to the Film Thread Podcast. I am Chris Gore, sometimes known as That Chris Gore, and I'm actually here live in Las Vegas at Star Trek Las Vegas. And joining me on the podcast for this special Star Trek episode is John Champion. Welcome to the show, John.
Man, thank you so much. It's been a lifelong dream of mine to be on the Film Threat podcast.
For real?
For real.
Really?
Lifelong meaning as long as there has been life in a Film Threat podcast, that is what I've wanted. Yes.
Well, it hasn't quite been a year, but this is the last day of the show here at Star Trek Las Vegas, which is a weird name. It's like San Diego Comic-Con, Star Trek Las Vegas. There's a lot of people just shorten it to hashtag STLV.
STLV 2017. This is the 11th one that I've been to. And I've been doing it for longer than that. But this is it. This is the granddaddy, the Mac Daddy, if you will, of all Star Trek conventions. This is the one to go to. Right.
I mean, what Star Wars Celebration is to Star Wars, Star Trek Las Vegas is to Star Trek?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Now, this convention, what I love most about this convention, as opposed to other conventions that I've attended, is that when you purchase a ticket to Star Trek Las Vegas, which it seems a little pricier maybe than other conventions, you are guaranteed a seat in the main hall. Meaning, if William Shatner is on stage, if Patrick Stewart is on stage, George Takei, anyone, you can walk in and there will be a seat because Creation will not sell more tickets than there are attendees.
Right. And I think that sort of permeates through the whole thing. It's crowded. There's a lot of people here, but you never feel like you're being pushed around. You never feel like you're going to miss something. And can I just say that everybody here is really pleasant. I've been to, let's say, some extremely large conventions, some very, city-spanning conventions, and you feel like if you make the wrong move, you're going to get trampled in order to get to where you're trying to go, or, God forbid, you're in the middle of the vendor room and you need to find a restroom. It's going to take you half an hour if you're lucky. This has been such a good vibe. Everybody is really pleasant, really supportive, really kind. And yeah, there are some lines to wait in every now and then if you're getting an autograph or a photo op. But like you said, you can just walk right into the main theater and it could be the biggest star here and you're going to find a seat. And they have the video screens up. So it's a really well-oiled machine.
Yeah, I would just say, as opposed to other convention experiences, Star Trek Las Vegas is one of my favorites, just simply because I can see every panel. I won't miss anything. However, you do get into those Sophie's Choice situations where this panel is happening here, but then this is happening over there, and then you have to choose. And then, of course, there's the distraction that is Las Vegas.
Right. So that's kind of the cool thing about it, though. I remember when I was a kid going to conventions in Atlanta and Birmingham. I grew up in Birmingham, so going to conventions, Atlanta was really the biggest nearby city. And the thing that I always loved was the convention after the convention. So you would do all this stuff during the day, but then it didn't matter. The lobby of the hotel, the bars, the restaurants, everything, they were always buzzing. There were always people doing things. And this is no different. So you hear my voice right now. I don't normally sound like this, but here's the thing. It's being at my table, talking to people all day, and then all night going out and talking to people. Again, you're talking over the noise of a bar, the noise of a restaurant, but it's just nonstop, and you fly in the adrenaline of the experience. It's awesome. I'm going to sleep all day Monday. All day Monday.
Yeah, there is definitely a recovery. I mean, there's already a recovery from Vegas, but definitely a recovery that comes from any convention experience, right? You really need that kind of decompress to just get back to the real world instead of what's happening on on the schedule today. So, yeah, but this is my 4th year coming here. I was fortunate enough last year to go to the 50th anniversary, which was incredible. So I was really happy to be able to attend that. And this year is the celebration of the 30th anniversary of Star Trek The Next Generation. So you've got some Star Trek The Next Gen reunions. You've got, panels dedicated to Next Generation. Unfortunately, Jonathan Frakes, I'm pretty sure that everyone is here, including guest stars. John Delancey did a panel I thought was excellent. But we're all here brought together by our love of all things Star Trek. And I think what's interesting about it is Star Trek comes with a set of values that I think that the people here at this convention, and it is, let's be honest, it is a much older crowd, right? I mean, Star Trek having a longer history.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a little bit of everything. I mean, I just sort of looking around the room right now, the average age is probably maybe 40s and above, but there are new fans coming in all the time. And that is what is awesome. So you see kids in uniforms, and it really is like a passing of the torch thing. So you see that original generation who grew up on TOS, then their kids grew up on Next Gen. Now their kids who are being exposed to like the JJ Abrams movies, and obviously there's a lot of excitement around Discovery. So this is it really is a family feeling event. It's another one of the things that contributes to this being such a good experience. Everybody here is a friend, whether you know them or not. Everybody here is a friend, and everybody is having an awesome time. And I love it when I see like a little kid wearing a TOS uniform or something really creative. I see a lot of mashup costumes these days, which is awesome. So it's so participatory at every level.
And I don't know, Star Trek was kind of my first motivation to actually go to a convention. And I want to talk to you about our first time, so to speak, our first experience with Star Trek.
Yeah.
But I recall when I was a kid, I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I dressed in full, I made a Mr. Spock outfit. Right? I just wore black pants. I combed my hair weird. I put on little elf ears. And then I had painted with just Tester's model paint the Star Trek insignia on a blue sweatshirt. My mother took a photograph of this Polaroid, and we went to, because at least from where I grew up in Royal Oak, Michigan, just outside of Detroit, there weren't conventions around, right? There were the convention at the time was sort of an adjunct to the Detroit Auto Show. So it would be the Detroit Auto Show is coming to town. And so what would happen is you'd go to the Detroit Auto Show, which I had no interest in as a kid. I did not care at all. Right. And there would be these little rooms, and it'd be like, okay, yeah, we're selling comic books in there. We're showing 16mm prints of old episodes of Star Trek and Doctor Who. And in addition, Adam West, Burt Ward, and William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy are signing autographs.
Yes.
So little me, walks up with this Polaroid of me dressed as Mr. Spock. I hand the Polaroid to Leonard Nimoy, who signs it. And I don't know if he was even charging at the time, but I have that to this day, this little Polaroid of me as Mr. Spock, signed by Leonard Nimoy. So, but of course, the convention scene has grown since then, and even previous to that, that had to be like in the 70s. That was definitely in the 70s. Conventions have grown into this huge business, and on your calendar you kind of plan around it, right? Like I've had weddings that have come up in the middle of conventions where I have to say to my family, I'm sorry, I can't go to your wedding. It's during San Diego Comic-Con. I can't. This has happened to me. It's very embarrassing.
Yeah. No, it's so funny that you mentioned that about the costume. I remember you did a different step than I did. I had either the blue or the yellow shirt, and then I cut out a little piece of cardboard and wrapped that in foil for the badge. Yeah, so I did that. And then do you remember the Star Trek it was not a pop-up book, but the one where you punch out the little models out of paper and you fold those together, and there's a phaser in there, a communicator in there, Spock's ears. It was like a printed thing, and you put those on. I remember that so well. And yeah, totally the same experience in Birmingham. I remember going to a car show, Burt Ward, Adam West. It was just right after Star Wars came out. So you had C-3PO, R2-D2, and Darth Vader. Who the hell knows who was in those costumes? Who knows? But they had people in the costume and signing autographs. So that was kind of awesome. And then as far as Star Trek, I think my first really big convention was Atlanta Fantasy Fair. So that preceded Dragon Con. Within the little conventions outside of that, Dixie Trek was the most fun by far. And it was the birth of conventions going from homegrown to being businesses. And I think there's an argument to be made, good and bad, about that happening. I mean, the good news is, look, we get to be in Vegas. We get to be in this hotel where you've got every service available to you. You've got...
And when we say every service, we actually mean every service available to you.
Every service. but yeah, you've got everything. And like you said earlier, being able to go out on the strip and go to different restaurants and just hang out, you get the whole experience around you. There's something really to be said for that. There's something also to be said for the homegrown thing. And obviously, Creation started as a couple of fans in the early 70s, just throwing these little events in a hotel ballroom, and that spirals and it gets bigger. I like to think that STLV is a little bit of both now. It is the big business, and it is a well-oiled machine, like I said. Well-oiled machine. Sorry, it's afternoon and it feels early. To me, this is sort of the best thing that you can get.
No, let me just jump on that point. I think that, to me, the best convention experiences are ones that are put together by people who are originally fans that just said, I want to do some fan gathering and center it around my own passion. So if you look at, for example, San Diego Comic-Con, it's still like the people who are nerdy that run it. It's mostly a volunteer organization. And when it comes to Star Trek Vegas, yes, it was started by, people who were fans. And when you look at some of the other conventions, I won't name names, Wizard, they're just made to make money. And you can kind of really spot the convention experiences that are all about, money, and then the ones that are fan run. And there's definitely, because the fan run ones, I think, do keep fans in mind. So,
and ultimately, I mean, remember, it's all about what the fans bring to it. And that's what I love about this, because just going out at night after this vendor room closes and kind of, go chill out for a little bit in the room, and then go down to the bars. And there are multiple here in the Rio, but then people doing off-site events. There was Gays in Space the other night. Fan Sets had a party the other night.
Klingon karaoke.
It's all the after-hours stuff that, again, no lie, like I said, you may not have met these people yet, but they are already your friends.
Oh my God, the Klingon karaoke.
Did you hear "Killing Me Softly" done by the Duras sisters? Oh my God, they practice it in Klingon. Phenomenal. It was so good.
How could I have missed that? That's crazy. But it's weird because, this whole thing kind of just turns into, you're walking around the Rio Hotel, which, let's be honest, if the Rio Hotel were a starship, it'd be the worst ship in the fleet. This is one of the worst hotels. And my experience here, just as a quick aside, I love the people here. Yeah. Love the convention. This hotel, first of all, when I got here, they put us on this floor that was, unbeknownst to me, the pet floor. So the entire floor smells of urine. Then they moved us to a different floor where they had a pipe burst, and they had this machine that was drying the walls, and it smelled of mold. So really, I think the USS Rio needs to be retired. They need to. Maybe they can have the convention here, but I definitely won't be back. But I do like that. Like, everywhere you go, there are people in Starfleet uniforms. I mean, it really is. It adds to the whole experience. But funny, we mentioned the costumes. You and I both, as young kids, created our own costumes. But what's funny was, do you remember at the time the kind of Halloween costumes that were sold?
I'm sorry. Well, first of all, the Ben Cooper stuff.
Yes, it was these horrible costumes where you would get, it'd be kind of this bad facsimile of whatever the person's face was, right? With these pop-out hollow eyes, right, and that horrible rubber band that went around your head, and that plastic would cut if it was any sharp edges.
So and they always had staples to hold it in place, so that would cut your face. And then the worst part of it was you had this vinyl thing that you would put on, this outfit that you would put on. And instead of like looking like a Star Trek uniform, it would have a picture of Spock and it would say Star Trek on it. And even as like a 5-year-old, I'd be like, no, he doesn't look like that. His uniform doesn't say Spock and have a picture of Spock. What are you doing?
Yeah, those costumes were so dumb because they had like the brand as like the chest area was just like Spock, Star Trek. It was clearly created by people that were just sort of factory, just had some template that they were using, and every costume was like the name of the character, a picture of the character you were supposed to be, in case when you went up to the door for Halloween they wouldn't know. But I mean, look, but I'm pretty sure that you wore costumes not exclusively on Halloween.
You would be right. So I remember, I was probably 5 or 6. So my grandmother, who recently passed away, but one of my favorite memories of her is that, so I would go stay with my grandparents in Georgia, a couple of weeks at a time. My parents would, go on vacation or something, and they were into whatever I was into. So 1977, we're hunting all over Southwest Georgia to find Star Wars action figures. I still have my land speeder that I bought at the time, and my grandmother made, she made a Dracula costume for me, a Superman costume for me, and again, not the, not that Ben Cooper where it says Superman on it. No, this was the full deal. I wanted it accurate, right? She made a $6 million man running suit for me, the red with the white stripes. And one of my favorite pictures, though, is me wearing that outfit, wearing the Star Trek utility belt with the phaser and communicator, and then holding my Mego Kirk and Spock action figures. So I was just going to mash up all the things I was into right there. Yeah.
I thought you were going to bring up the Mego action figures. These sort of, this was from the 70s, these sort of cheesy, and they actually had clothes for them. And it was
so good that the likenesses were okay, depending on the figure you got, but the cloth uniforms,
yeah, they were cool. But yeah, so I don't know if I properly introduced you, but there's a reason that you're on this show. Not just that you and I are friends outside of doing this show, but also the fact that you are a lifelong Star Trek fan and legit nerd of many shades, not just Star Trek. And you host the Mission Log podcast for Roddenberry, which basically covers each episode of the podcast is about an episode of Star Trek, and you actually finished the original series. Now you moved on to Next Generation.
Yeah, so we started the show 5 years ago, and I say this all the time because it is really worth repeating that we owe all of this to Rod Roddenberry, our show, because he's the one who came up with the idea. The way I tell the story, and other people might tell the story differently, he and I were just having a drink, and he had finished Trek Nation, which is a documentary about his father, Gene Roddenberry. So that was his way to explore Gene's life and what he was about, what made him tick. It took him 10 years to do that. And then at the end of it, he said, but the next step is I need to figure out what Star Trek is about. All his life, people have been coming up to Rod saying, your father's show changed my life. And can you imagine hearing that your entire life and you don't really know what to make of it? Because he wasn't necessarily brought up with Star Trek. He was aware of it, but it wasn't his thing. So he said, here's what we do. We should sit down and do a rewatch of all of Star Trek. I'm like, cool, sign me up. I'll come up to your place. We'll drink some wine. We'll start this process of watching Star Trek. And he goes, no. We should watch all of Star Trek, but we should do something with it. Whether it's a blog or a podcast or a book or something, because the goal is to figure out what makes it tick. Why do people still come up and say they were changed by it? Why is it that people are so inspired by it? And then I said, cool, so we're doing a podcast. And he's like, no, you're doing a podcast. but he already had this in mind. And he's friends with another guy, Ken Ray, who he said, you got to meet Ken because he does this other great podcast about Apple News and Mac technology. And at the time, I was doing a podcast called DVD Geeks, which is how you and I met. That started as a TV show, and it was a web series, and evolved into a live radio show, and then a podcast. So Rod was already familiar with my work through that. And honestly, it just kind of worked. It kind of clicked. And the whole premise from the beginning really hasn't changed at all, was to say, all right, take an episode by episode, movie by movie. roughly the correct order, the correct release order, not strict chronological order, but series order. So we did The Cage, TOS, then the animated series, then the first 6 movies. So we wanted to finish the arc of the TOS characters. Then Next Gen. Now we're in season 7 of Next Gen. We'll do the 4 Next Gen movies because I consider Generations. It's a Next Gen movie with special guest star Captain Kirk. And then DS9, Voyager, Enterprise. And it's a deep dive. We do, we pick apart a show, and there's a little bit of a recap to figure out just what the plot is, but then it's about what is the message, what is the heart of the show, what is this trying to say? Not every episode is trying to say something, but if it is it relevant? And is that what people are keying into that inspires them with Star Trek as a whole?
Well, I mean, I think that's why Star Trek resonated with me as a kid. I'll tell you my quick introduction to Star Trek story is my dad loved NASA. My dad was into the space program, and he went to college for computer sciences when computers were these giant wall-sized things that had punch cards, and my dad would bring the punch cards home from work, which I would just color on. They were sort of pointless. But and then I remember one day he actually took me to work, and we had started watching Star Trek together, and it was always something where Star Trek always spurred a conversation. So it was, I never saw it, I don't recall ever seeing it in first run. My father must have seen it because he loved the space program. And when it was in second run and Star Trek was on TV every day, it became like a daily thing where we'd watch an episode, and then every episode inspired a discussion, whether it was about, it could be about whatever was in the episode, but also, the layers underneath, because that's what I think made Star Trek so great, is that it's a show about ideas. It's not a show about shooting and blowing up things, although it's maybe become that in when it comes to the Star Trek movies, both the JJ and the original series ones. It's about blowing stuff up. I think it was only motion picture that really attempted to get cerebral, but those conversations that my father and I had were just to me it just helped us bond, because I think that men in general have maybe not so much today, but I think at the time I grew up, it was difficult for men to bond over anything other than sports. So Star Trek was how my father and I bonded. And I remember he took me to work one day, to his computer work, where he worked for Chrysler, and sat me in front of a computer, and I played a text-based Star Trek game. And I remember freaking out when the text just said, because you basically were just pointing in what direction you were going, "You have left dry dock." It was incredible. So that early introduction to Star Trek, and then I always later associated Star Trek with my relationship with my dad. So that's how I got introduced to Star Trek, the series. And then just being a kid and being nerdy, and not every kid was into Star Trek. A lot of kids were. Maybe they were nerdy kids, but they weren't always into Star Trek. So, but what's you must have a tale as well.
First of all, can I say that I love the fact that your dad worked on those giant computers, because right now my home office is so full of junk. They got routers and drives and all. My dream is to build a false wall that would be like a UNIVAC IBM 386, that kind of thing in front of it. But I remember growing up and Trek was around. So, and I think at the time my mom, she had stopped working, and this was a thing that was just on in syndication, so you couldn't avoid it. And it was a good time in the early 70s that all the merchandising was really kicking into gear. So those Mego figures, the Colorform set, oh man, the Colorform set was so cool. And it was a weird thing, like going into Star Trek the motion picture, when all you knew of Star Trek was that classic.
Yeah, well, here's the funny thing about it. Okay, I'm sure you saw Star Wars, as we all experienced it. But what's weird about that, Star Wars was a surprise. I remember seeing trailers for Star Wars like on late night TV, and I thought, oh, this is cool. The Wolfman is in it, because they had like this shot of Chewbacca on the Millennium Falcon, and I thought, oh, it looks like the Wolfman. But when I saw Star Wars, it was a surprise. There wasn't a big marketing campaign behind it. I mean, even like the marketing was terrible. It's about a boy, a girl, and a galaxy. It was terrible. Like, I don't think they knew what they were marketing at the time. Conversely, Star Trek, I looked forward to. I mean, it was.
Yeah.
I read every, Carrie O'Quinn article in Starlog magazine and in Preview magazine and in Fantastic Films and all these other magazines that came out in the wake of Star Wars. Famous Monsters. If there was an article about Star Trek, I wanted to know about it. And for years we were told there was going to be a Star Trek Phase 2. And Star Trek Phase 2 was going to be the sequel series. It would be a new Star Trek series, later with a different group. Leonard Nimoy was originally not on it and whatnot. They created some new Vulcan character. And so for years we looked forward to Star Trek. And I'm curious. You were around at that time. You remember, so we were looking forward to Star Trek and getting involved in the hype and whatnot. And that wasn't the case with Star Wars, where it was a surprise. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing it. I believe it was December 6, 1979. December 7th. Yes.
Well, live in infamy.
Right. Yeah. But what's your experience with that and seeing the first film? Because I'm just curious, and no surprise, I went with my dad. He and I went to see the movie, and if you recall. Yeah. There was an overture. Oh, yes. There was an overture, and there's very few films have overture. Black Hole actually had an overture also, among others. But I'm curious about your 1979 Star Trek experience leading up from Phase 2, how much you knew about it and reading those magazines.
Yeah. All right, so same experience. I remember reading Starlog and just, seeing all those guys on the Today Show, seeing William Shatner, seeing Leonard Nimoy, all the press around it. It was so exhilarating. When Star Wars came out, I remember literally going into my parents' bedroom. There was a newspaper kind of open and a little ad for Star Wars, and I think my dad said, "Oh, we're going to a movie tonight," so we all go see Star Wars. Amazing, mind-blowing, life-changing event, right? But the anticipation around Star Trek was something entirely different. I can tell you exactly what happened on December. Well, it might have been a day later. It might have been the 8th for me. But going to see Star Trek the Motion Picture, going with my mom, we had gone to McDonald's because they had the tie-in for Star Trek the Motion Picture. The world's first Happy Meal was a tie-in to Star Trek the Motion Picture. So I got the Happy Meal. There's a Klingon cartoon, a little joke thing on the side panel. And then I had the watch. It was this little blue translucent plastic thing. You put stickers on it, and it had a little compartment in there where you could hide a note. So I wore that, and there we are watching Star Trek the Motion Picture. That opening music still gives me chills. I think that is probably my favorite soundtrack of any Star Trek film, hands down. It is beautiful. It is cinematic in every sense. It is a remarkable score, so please go get it if you don't have it. And I just remember being in awe of that movie. I remember thinking at the time that it was long, that it was slow. Okay, but that was 7-year-old me. Here we are so many years later, and every time I watch that movie again, I get a new appreciation for it, because they were doing something bold and artistic, and they were doing something that tied perfectly into the philosophy of what the original series had been. Now, here's the thing. You said that Star Trek movies and Star Trek TV, depending on when you catch it, they lean toward let's blow stuff up. And you're right. And I think that both of those things can coexist if they're done right. We've seen maybe some not doing it right, and that's unfortunate. And I don't know what the future holds for Star Trek in terms of the style that we'll get. But I hope that if what we get down the road is going to be blowing up and shooting and spaceships and all that stuff, fine, as long as you can still find heart in that. You can use a war story to tell a story about humanity. And I think when Star Trek is at its best, it's about people, purely about people. So the background can change, It's just what the writers will do on top of that will make it truly feel like Star Trek. Sorry, there's a bit of a tangent, but yeah, Star Trek motion picture, awesome. And a great time seeing it.
What's weird is it's for me, it is also my personal favorite Star Trek film, just because I think it aspired to do something bigger. Mm-hmm. I think the production was troubled because most of the budget was, squandered in pre-production for a TV series they never made. So it was parts of sets of this. And so when they said it had this huge budget, or one of the biggest budgets of a movie of all time, it's not true, because the actual money that was used to make the movie was, less than what was reported. But I just have a fondness for that film because it tried to do something bigger. I mean, the first movie I actually remember seeing in the theater was my dad taking me to see 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that's weird for a 5-year-old. It was a retrospective screening. I was a little freaked out. And I remember at the time, bizarre tangent, but I remember when I was a little kid, not liking movies because I thought they were fake. And by that I mean, but here's my toddler logic, okay? I'm under 5 years old, so stay with my childlike logic.
Yeah.
Was movies were fake because no one ever went to the bathroom. So no one went to the bathroom. I thought, well, these movies are fake. When do the characters on the movie go to the bathroom? And I'd seen Wizard of Oz and a whole bunch of other films that had West Side Story, a lot of movies I had seen that were television events. When I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey, as you're aware, one of the characters goes to the bathroom and sees instructions. And I remember that freaked me out. It was the first time that, logic. Now remember, most of your concerns at a young age are things like going to the bathroom and, not eating and mommy and daddy and whatnot. So, me being maybe a precocious, thinking about things I shouldn't at that age, that struck me. And so seeing 2001 kind of blew me away. So I liked that Star Trek the Motion Picture attempted to do something bigger. It does make me sad that they didn't have the time to edit, because this is at an era in filmmaking when unfortunately they had to make a deadline, which is kind of, look, they announce these movies and then they have a release date before they've even finished the script in many cases. In Star Trek, unfortunately, just from a standpoint of to their stockholders, it had to be released on a certain day. So Robert Wise wanted to spend another 6-9 months, maybe a year editing, and that was normal. That was how you finished a movie, and then you spent time editing the movie and getting a feel for it and finding a tone and changing things and maybe, adding some additional photography and whatnot. He didn't have the luxury of that. The editors just slapped together an assembly of the film, and that's what we got. There is a director's cut that exists in standard def that I also own that I think is great. Now, everyone counts Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, as being the best of the Star Trek movies, but for me it'll always be motion picture, because it's the only movie to me of the Star Trek films that feels like a movie. The other ones do feel like extended television episodes when it comes to the original series. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, 100%. Thank goodness Robert Wise lived long enough to work on that director's cut, because it is a fantastic retooling of a movie. You and I could sit here all day and pick apart the mistakes that George Lucas made by going back to the well and trying to fix, quote unquote, what happened with Star Wars. Totally unnecessary. When Star Trek the Motion Picture premiered in 1979, they literally delivered wet prints in Washington, D.C. for the premiere party. This is how fresh this thing was. A total tight deadline, had to be flown cross-country to get it to that premiere. So it was an unfinished film in that respect. And the fact that you could go back to a master like Robert Wise, come on, the guy, West Side Story, worked on Citizen Kane, the fact that he was still alive and was interested enough to come back and work on this thing and correct the things that were unavoidably wrong with the movie. It's remarkable, and it gives you, it doesn't change the theme of the movie, but it changes part of the experience of the movie, gives you a deeper appreciation for the characters, I think. Star Trek II, obviously, there was this feeling that, motion picture was so over budget, and like you pointed out, it truly was not. Side note here, one of the things that Rod and I have been working on recently with Larry Nemechek, Dr. Trek, we're about to launch a new show called The Trek Files. We have boxes and boxes of Gene's personal documents, particularly from the 70s, and there's all this gray area of what happened between the animated series and the motion picture when they tried to get Phase 2 off the ground. They tried to get a couple of movies off the ground, Planet of the Titans, and none of that stuff quite panned out. But this is all that development time where sometimes he was employed by Paramount, sometimes he was not, sometimes a picture was greenlit, sometimes it was not. Years and years worth of development work that ultimately turned into Star Trek the Motion Picture. But yeah, it was not the normal route of a movie to take. Wrath of Khan is a brilliant movie, and it is tight and it is fun. and it is about the bad guy. It's a revenge movie, all right? Nothing wrong with that. You can tell that kind of story in Star Trek. The mistake is when people who are maybe writing Star Trek, Bob Orsi, look at that movie and say, well, you can't have Kirk without Khan. Well, no. Kirk existed. Well, Kirk doesn't literally exist, but yes, Kirk existed for 79 episodes, only one of those being with Khan, and 6 other movies, only one of those being with Khan. That's not what Star Trek is about. Khan has its own life. Khan is the thing that George Costanza yells, and everybody else yells when they're just trying to be ironic and funny and show their anger, you know? So I love that movie. I still get choked up at the end when Spock dies, because to me, that movie is about Spock's journey. In the first 25 years of Star Trek are about Spock's journey reconciling his human half. That's the message about humanity embracing itself and embracing what it means to be human, just told through this remarkable alien character. The later on you get with the movies, I think they did some really smart stuff with Star Trek 3. They had a lot of fun with Star Trek 4. Star Trek 5, I mean, here's the thing. Bad movie, fascinating topic. And then 6, you know, it seemed like the perfect way to do the send-off. But you're right, it felt like almost series by rote. Like, we just have to get our characters from point A to point B to point C and wrap it all up at the end. And, you know, sometimes that fails.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I think I've enjoyed the Star Trek films. I think Star Trek 5 is the one that was the most disappointing. Sure. Because I look forward to it so much, because the other films were so... I mean, it just seemed like it was telling this story that was about the characters, sort of back to what television did well. But I do think Star Trek lives best on TV. Yeah. I do think it lives best on television, which is why when Star Trek The Next Generation was, you know, about to be released, it was, oh, this is Star Trek coming back to TV. This is, I remember... every episode of the show I would watch in first run and call my dad after. We'd have a conversation about that particular episode, and Encounter at Farpoint, you know, it was an interesting way to introduce the characters. I remember really liking Data. I thought, you know, I liked the design of the ship. I thought it was very sleek. I liked the message of that. It wasn't blowing things up. It was this strange life form that was misunderstood, like the Horta in the original series. So much like, but I mean, in good ways. Yeah. I mean, what were your thoughts on the relaunch of Star Trek: The Next Generation in the 80s? Yeah. I'm curious.
So, oh man, I had a lot of mixed feelings at the time. You're right. In retrospect, Encounter at Farpoint is such a classically Star Trek story, and it's a lot of DC Fontana in it and a lot of Gene Roddenberry in it, for better or for worse. You know, because you basically have 2 stories going on. You have Farpoint, but you also have Q, because they needed to stretch out the show. But it totally works because it is what Star Trek is about. You know, Kirk famously saying, there are no unknowns, only things temporarily misunderstood. And that's the message in Devil in the Dark. The Horta, you made the absolute right comparison to Encounter at Farpoint. All right, flashback, 1986, 87. Here's 15-year-old John, also desperately reading Starlog magazine and trying to get every piece, because no internet, you can't just log on and read all the rumors, right? And my friends who are getting little pieces of information, I remember my buddy Joe saying, there's a robot, and he's called Data. They named the robot Data, and we just sort of rolled our eyes like, oh, really? They couldn't do any better than that, you know. And we're just making fun of everything, right? I think March of 1987. My mom picks me up from school one day and says, "We're going to New York. You have an audition." And that was when I auditioned for Wesley Crusher.
Why did I not know this about you, John? I've known you for years. I never know. You tell me about this.
Yeah. So, summer of 1986, I lived in New York at the invitation of an agent, and I didn't do a whole lot. I had some little bit roles here and there. I went to a couple of acting schools at the time, and it was really just like, it was a great experience. It was a time for me to be in New York, have a different kind of life than living in Birmingham, and it was really cool. And around that time, or maybe fall of that year, the rumors kick into gear. There's going to be a new Star Trek. There's going to be a new Star Trek. So I called my agent and said, look, get me an audition, whatever it takes, whatever you can do. I got to know about this. And then out of nowhere, like I said, my mom picks me up, and we flew out that night, and we went to New York. At the time, Paramount was owned by Gulf and Western. So they had an office in New York at Columbus Circle. I went in, had an audition. They called me back the next day, went in, had an audition. They put me on tape, and then I never really heard anything else, right? And obviously, Will got the role, and he and I had a good laugh about that years and years and years later. And I talked about how I called him a miserable little pinhead ever since that moment. But 30 years later, I'm sitting in an office at Roddenberry going through boxes of stuff, right? Going through memos. There's a memo from the casting director in New York with a list of people being considered for Star Trek The Next Generation. And there's a lot of recognizable names on there. One of those, like B.B. Newworth for Dr. Crusher, will not relocate from New York, right? So she's out of the running. And then John Champion, Wesley Crusher, MMG Management. And here's the thing, I've thought about that story, and I obviously remember doing the audition, but it seems like another lifetime, another person at this point. Holding that document that was stamped at Gene Roddenberry's office from that casting agent, I was a little blown away. I was just a little like, wow, that actually happened. That was an actual thing in my life. And there it is in black and white, that now one of my best friends, his dad, got that on his desk 30 years ago. It was really mind-blowing.
Wow. It's so weird because I think, just in celebration of Star Trek The Next Generation at this, Star Trek Vegas event, a lot of people are saying that the character of Wesley Crusher was misunderstood. I remember the two things that stood out to me that I did not like about the show was, one, I didn't like the uniforms. I thought they looked like pajamas. They just didn't, they were ill-fitting, I think. It was in later seasons they finally those uniforms look good. But those first season ones, I'd love to see someone cosplay as a first season Next Gen. That would be hilarious.
Dude, challenge accepted. Next year here, I think that'll happen.
And then Wesley Crusher was a character I didn't like because I thought, it's the kid, always gets it. But if you think about it and you look at the way millennials deal with technology he was almost a character ahead of its time, in addition to, and I have a photo of you. I have a photo of you in the, the mankini, or what is it called?
the scant.
Yeah,
yes.
The scant.
Yeah,
It's what's in being so forward thinking, Gene Roddenberry at the time in the 80s was like, gender, race, ethnicity, even alien form, no one's going to care. And there were men wearing pants, there were women in skirts, and there were men wearing these sort of...
dress. Essentially a dress, like a mini dress from the 60s.
And trans culture is now a part of our mainstream conversation, but way back then, Roddenberry was forward thinking in the future no one's going to care about this. And it's weird that this is, and we're having this discussion, and I feel like we're maybe devolving back at a few decades. But
I remember at the time thinking like, all right, the jellyfish at the end of Encounter at Farpoint, is that really the best special effect? Whatever. But I remember at the time thinking like, this is bold, this is new, this is different. It feels like Star Trek. It certainly does. They're on the Enterprise, and it's a calmer, more serene, less sexy Enterprise, maybe. Hated the phasers. Still kind of do. Was not a big fan of the design of the Enterprise D, but you could tell that this was Star Trek in the future. You could tell that this is sort of the logical extension of Star Trek going into the future. And seeing stuff like that, seeing families on board, and this being a 12-year mission instead of a 5-year mission, and seeing men in these scants, and seeing women wearing non-traditional, in the respect of what we saw in TOS, it really telegraphed something to the audience that this was a different world. And I thought they did that brilliantly. Now, Wesley, all right, yeah, I had my own bone to pick with Wesley at the time. But now I think the worst thing you can say about it is simply that Will did a great job given what he was given. The writing was not sophisticated writing for a child at the time. Now you've got a lot of shows that have a lot of depth written for children. And I don't know what has changed in Hollywood, what's changed in the way that writers are being trained nowadays, but that was one failing of that show. They gave some of the best material for kids to other kids who were guest stars on the show. Actually, so right behind us, I'm looking at this rendering here of Jeremy Astor. They did a whole episode about this kid who had lost his father, and then within the episode lost his mother. And this is really important stuff. A child who is now an orphan on the Enterprise, how does this world of the 24th century take care of this kid? Well, we kind of lost that opportunity with Wesley. We knew that his father was gone, but then you just every now and then have a pat on the back for Wesley, like, oh, you learned a lesson this week, and you saved the ship again this week, and it was too bad it went that way. You know?
God, it's so strange. But circling back a little bit, you brought up Star Trek: The Animated Series. I loved that show.
Yes.
That was required viewing on Saturday morning when there was a Saturday morning television. Now with internet and streaming, no one knows that experience doesn't exist. But that animated series was incredible because also it was, first of all, the voice acting is done by the original series cast, and I know Leonard Nimoy in particular fought for the original, George Takei and Nichelle Nichols and whatnot, the rest of the group to be a part of that, and it was also scripts that were left over from the original series, so the writing was fantastic. It was really a much more adult show. There's an episode where Spock goes back and sees his younger self going through. I mean, it's that episode. I mean, that. Oh my God! If that was an episode of the original series, it would have been incredible. And the great thing from a budgetary standpoint, they could do a lot of great stuff. What I do love is there are a few things that are ridiculous. Like there's one episode where they all shrink, and I remember posting a photo of that on Facebook and just writing canon, because because the animated series is supposed to be canon. But I love that show, and it really. I mean, there aren't many episodes of it. It's just. But yeah.
So they only made 22 episodes. It's a season and a half essentially, and. I have to say that, like, my brilliant co-host Ken Ray said something a couple of years ago when somebody asked if the animated series was canon.
Man, you are struggling, man.
I'm struggling so bad.
It's it's con voice. This happens like at the end of every con. It's just what everyone sounds like.
Yeah. Ken said something very brilliant. Somebody asked if the animated series was canon, and he said, that's not a very interesting question. A more interesting question is it Star Trek? And hands down, 100%, it's Star Trek. It's DC Fontana, it's Gene Roddenberry, it's bringing in other writers who are around for TOS, like David Gerrold, some new voices of classic science fiction like Larry Niven, to write this show and use these characters and use this bigger sandbox to tell these stories. It doesn't matter that they're for kids. It's Star Trek. They're telling Star Trek style stories, just in a different venue, a different realm, So, look, I'm not a writer for TV. Canon doesn't mean anything to me because I'm not sitting in a writer's room with somebody saying, oh, well, this particular thing is off limits, but you can go here, but you can't. Look, that's not my job. I'm just a fan watching the show.
But it's interesting. I learned a lot about. Well, here's a fun fact. I'm sure you might know is that they used to record. So they would record like the audio for the Star Trek cartoon, Leonard Nimoy and Shatner, and they would basically record it onto an audio cassette and mail it to Filmation, right? It was, and in some cases because they traveled and they had other work, they needed lines recorded. Leonard Nimoy would just in his hotel room with a tape recorder record his voice acting, take the cassette, put it in mail. There was no FedEx at the time, and then that's how they would make the show. I just find that really interesting. That was so unsophisticated.
Well, I think it was the first 3 episodes they recorded as a cast together because they could, and it was sort of the launch for this series. And there's a lovely picture somewhere of them all kind of reuniting and being behind the mics. But then, right after that, they're all in different directions. Shatner was doing a lot of theater at the time, and I think if you read his book, he talks about being in Florida, I want to say, and like living out of a camper, but then just having a little cassette recorder, doing his lines, and that gets shipped in and cut together to be a show. Yeah.
Wow. It's just when you look at the achievement of the original series, and that they didn't have a lot of effects, but the one thing that they did in the design of the Starship Enterprise, which I still think is the original Starship Enterprise design, is one of the best designed ships, like in all of filmed science fiction. It just is. And they used a company called the Rand Corporation, which was a think tank, to come up with, well, how would this work? What would they do with this? What about? I mean, I love that kind of thinking was involved. When you look at like this, I feel like there's almost a ridiculousness now that we've gotten. We've been living with genre films in television and movies, for decades now, and just to find an original design that is memorable, I think is difficult when you look at especially when you look at the Star Wars prequels or the new Star Trek movies, and you look at these and you look at the designs, and it's no surprise that JJ Abrams, when he goes to reboot, Star Wars, just says we're just going to use the ships that we like, and so and JJ Abrams also rebooted Star Trek, which would, I think, if we started talking about that would be a whole episode.
A whole other show.
Yeah, but what are your thoughts on that? I actually quite like the 2009 version. I think it made Star Trek relevant to people who don't like Star Trek.
Yeah.
And I'm not a fan of the second two movies. I think that there are problems. So
interesting. All right. So yes. So I think I agree with you. I like 2009 for sure. Into Darkness, there's a terrible aspect of it and a great aspect of it. The terrible aspect is that they went back to the well in the wrong way and decided it would be clever to take lines from another movie and plug those into the mouths of other characters. And I'm sorry, that's not clever. Look, even if you're doing a parody, it's not clever. A movie like Airplane is a brilliant parody because they're able to capture the essence of what made the thing ridiculous or funny. Fast forward several years, in movies like superhero movie, epic movie, they're not funny because they literally are just saying, hey, remember this scene? Hey, remember this scene? And Into Darkness felt like that to me. Hey, remember that time there was Khan? Hey, remember that time that there was a guy trapped in a radiation chamber? Hey, remember that time that guy died? So it took me out of it completely. I think with Beyond, they tried to circle back and they tried to tell a more Star Trek story with a more Star Trek theme to it. I will give you this, again with credit to my co-host on Mission Log, is that the good thing about Into Darkness, if you can separate your distaste for the film, is that they end that movie with a Kirk speech. And the Kirk speech says, when something horrible has happened to you, meaning you, humanity, who are you in the face of that? How do you respond in the face of that? My favorite scene in Into Darkness is Scotty quitting, saying, I'm not going to be a part of this revenge mission. That is not why I signed up for Starfleet. And it takes the movie for Kirk to realize why that is and who he should be as a captain. This is all brilliant stuff, which should not have been in that movie. So I have definitely some mixed feelings about that. Now, what I do love about what JJ Abrams did, and I feel very strongly about this, and I feel very strongly about this for Discovery, is that if you were given the keys to the kingdom to say, look, all of this storytelling, all of these tools for storytelling are now yours. Go make of it what you will. You should have the artistic integrity and creativity to go make that your own and do something exciting with it. Gene Roddenberry is the one who said, in an interview shortly before he passed away, I hope that in 20 years, somebody else comes along and does something new with Star Trek. And he was very prescient because that's what happened. Now, you can argue about style, you can argue about all of that stuff, but as long as you find heart, I don't really care about the trappings. I don't really care about what the Klingons look like or don't look like. I just want you to tell a story about humanity in the future. And Star Trek at its heart is very aspirational. Who do we get to be when we put aside the things that hold us back? That's what it comes down to.
Well, I mean, we could probably do 6 more episodes just talking about Star Trek.
Let's do it.
But I mean,
I'm on board.
But you're someone who lives and breathes this, having done for years now a Star Trek podcast, Mission Log. But so I'll just leave it at that. But I am optimistic. I think that that's the one thing that I love about Star Trek is it's an optimistic view of the future. And I think that now more than ever, we need some optimism based on our current state of politics and the country and just how divided we all are as a nation. I'm talking about the United States, of course. But so we need that kind of optimism. I mean, I would like to think that there's an optimistic view of the future, and things are kind of bleak in terms of our, the environment and just so many issues that we have to tackle as a civilization. What are humans going to be like in 500 years? And I hope that vision is something like Star Trek. And I'm optimistic for Star Trek Discovery to not only be a show that will capture the imagination of people and be popular, but also an opportunity to deal with some of the issues that we're dealing with as a culture today, which I think is what Star Trek always did best.
I think, to us, and doing Mission Log, which is a reflection of Star Trek, to us, it's more important to address the morals, meanings, messages. What are the big ideas here instead of getting mired in the politics? Look, Star Trek is a political show. There's no question about it. And people who say otherwise aren't getting it. But Star Trek is a show about issues. It's about humanity. It's about who we are and how we treat each other. But it's not a partisan show. It's not a show that is trying to say, like, hey, this candidate who did this thing or this political leader who did this thing is wrong or is right. It tries to go a step beyond that, and that's the beauty of science fiction, and that's what we try to capture in our discussion, is to say, let's separate ourselves from that for a minute. Let's separate ourselves from the minutia of bickering for a minute and say, what is the bigger principle here at stake? And that's why you could have a show like Star Trek in the 60s during the Vietnam War to address things like, arming, fighting nations in a proxy war, or the draft, or whatever it may be, and really be able to ask the audience to say, all right, what's the bigger picture?
And the good thing is now we've solved all those problems.
Yeah, it's all just clear skies ahead. Yeah.
But John, thank you for being on the show. I mean, this is great. I mean, you and I have been friends for years. We get together. We had similar upbringings in terms of our interest in nerd culture, and I'm sure you read science fiction novels and comic books and all that stuff. But I find strange that all these years I've known you and I didn't know that you actually auditioned for Wesley Crusher in Next Generation. Yeah. I think that's fantastic. John, where can people find you and listen to the show? Give them your 411.
Yeah, best place is going to be missionlogpodcast.com. From there, you can get linked out to Mission Log Pod at Twitter, Mission Log Pod on Facebook. And right now, we're kind of still in this launch phase of the Roddenberry Podcast Network. So podcast.roddenberry.com. It's Mission Log. But we've also teamed up with Women at Warp and Priority One. New shows on the way because, maybe there's some new Star Trek coming. Maybe that needs some more attention. So we'll see what we can do there.
Great. And, I wish my co-host on Film Threat, Anthony Ray Bench, could have joined me for this. But sadly, he's not in Vegas. So he's off this week. But, John, thanks again for being on the show.
A total pleasure. This is kind of how we talk anyway. Yeah. So it's a little weird that it's just on tape now. Yeah.
This is an hour-long conversation that we would just have in a bar talking about Trek and nerdy stuff. It never ends. That conversation, that's actually my favorite part is, while I love panels and the con floor and merch room and whatnot, my favorite thing about coming to conventions is just having conversations with friends like you, just in the hotel bar. I think is that should be a podcast right there, the hotel bar.
Absolutely. And one last thing, Film Threat sucks.
Thanks.
But also Tori's here too now. Now I'm here. I'm taking over the podcast. It's me, Tori from Roddenberry. Film Threat for life.
This is like a con-like villain. Yeah. So John, thanks for being on the show, and Tori, no thanks. And let's get out of here. Engage.